You would think hanging a small flag on your porch would be no big deal, right? But apparently, my HOA thought it was the beginning of the end of civilization. It all started a week before Memorial Day. I had just bought a brand new American flag, bright, crisp, and shining in the morning light. My plan was simple: hang it up, pay my respects, and maybe grill some burgers over the weekend. The next morning, I went outside with my cup of coffee and saw the flag waving gently in the wind. It looked perfect, the kind of sight that just makes you proud for no reason. But by noon, I noticed something strange. There was a white envelope taped to my front door. I pulled it off and opened it right there on the porch. Inside was a printed notice from the HOA board that read, "All exterior displays, including flags, are prohibited unless approved by the HOA Architectural Committee." And underneath, in bold, "Failure to comply within 48 hours may result in fines." I actually laughed at first. I thought it was some kind of misunderstanding. I mean, who bans flags? Especially during a national holiday week. So I decided to call the HOA office directly. A woman named Denise answered. She had that customer service tone that sounds polite but feels like a wall. I said, "Hey, I just got a notice about my flag. I think there must be a mistake." She replied, "No mistakes, sir. The board recently voted to prohibit all personal displays on exterior property, including flags." I said, "You mean any flag? What about sports teams or seasonal banners? Those are also not allowed." She said flatly, "Uniform appearance is very important to our community aesthetic." I nearly choked on my coffee. "Uniform appearance," I repeated. "You do realize this is America, right? People have been flying flags for centuries," she sighed. "Sir, I do not make the rules. You can submit an appeal in writing if you wish." That was the moment something snapped in me. I looked back at that flag, still waving proudly, and thought, no way am I taking that down. So I wrote my appeal, politely explaining that displaying the national flag was a matter of personal expression and respect for the country, especially around Memorial Day. 2 days later, I received their response. Appeal denied. Remove the flag immediately to avoid penalties. And that was it. No explanation. No discussion. Just a printed warning, again taped to my front door, like a scarlet letter. I remember standing there, holding that paper, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. Neighbors were walking their dogs, mowing their lawns, pretending like nothing was happening. But I knew they saw it too. One of them, my next-door neighbor, Joe, called over the fence and said, "They got you too, huh?" "Wait," I said. "What do you mean, too?" He pointed toward his porch, or what used to be his porch display. The spot where his Marine Corps flag usually hung was now empty. "They sent me a notice last week," he said. "Told me to take it down," I argued, "but they threatened to fine me $100 a day." That was when I realized this was not just about me. The HOA had actually been going around threatening people who showed any kind of personal pride or decoration. Flags, flowers, banners, all gone. It was ridiculous. So, that night, I came up with a plan. I went online and started reading the HOA bylaws word for word. I looked up federal flag laws, and guess what I found? There is an actual federal law, the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act, that says no homeowners association can prohibit a resident from displaying the U.S. flag on their property, as long as it is done properly. It was right there in black and white. The HOA had no legal ground to stand on. The next morning, instead of taking my flag down, I added 2 more, one on each side of the porch. When Joe saw me doing it, he burst out laughing. "You are going to make Craig lose his mind," he said. Craig, of course, was the HOA president, a man who seemed to take pride in ruining joy. By afternoon, he was standing on my lawn, red in the face, waving a clipboard. "Sir, you are in violation of HOA Code for B Section 7, he barked. "You have 24 hours to comply." I handed him a printed copy of the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act and said, "Actually, Craig, you are in violation of federal law." He blinked. "What?" "Yeah," I said. "This little document right here says that you cannot ban me from displaying the flag. So maybe you should read up before threatening fines." He looked stunned for a moment, then muttered something about checking with legal counsel and stormed off. By evening, half the neighborhood had heard about it. Joe came over with a beer and said, "Man, that was epic. You should have seen his face." But I knew Craig was not the type to back down easily. And sure enough, the next morning, another letter showed up. This time, it was a formal notice of escalation, stating that the HOA was consulting their attorney for possible enforcement actions. At that point, I realized something bigger was happening. It was not just a petty flag dispute anymore. It was about standing up for what is right. So, I made one more move that would change everything. I called the local news. When I first called the local news station, I did not really expect them to care. I figured they probably got dozens of calls every week from angry homeowners. But to my surprise, the reporter on the other end, a woman named Laura, sounded immediately interested. "Wait," she said, "you are saying your HOA banned the American flag right before Memorial Day?" "That is exactly what I am saying," I replied. There was a brief silence. Then she said, "We will be there tomorrow morning." And just like that, things started rolling faster than I could have imagined. The next day, a small news van pulled up right in front of my driveway. The cameraman stepped out, followed by Laura with her microphone in hand. My neighbors peeked through their blinds like it was the most exciting thing that had happened all year. We set up right in front of my porch where the 3 flags waved proudly in the breeze. Laura asked me a few simple questions. I told her how the HOA had sent multiple threats, how they ignored federal law, and how this was not about decoration. It was about respect. When we finished, she turned to the camera and said, "In a neighborhood where patriotism is being fined, one homeowner is standing his ground." I could not help but smile. By evening, that segment aired on the 6 o'clock news, and the response was wild. Within hours, my phone was blowing up. Friends from across town called to say they had seen me on TV. The video clip was posted online and shared hundreds of times. Then came the flood of comments. "Good for him. Someone had to stand up. What kind of HOA bans the flag? Ridiculous. We need more people like this guy." By the next morning, several other local stations had picked up the story. Reporters started showing up one after another. My quiet little street suddenly felt like a press conference zone. Craig, the HOA president, was furious. I saw him pacing near his driveway, talking on his phone, his face as red as a stop sign. Soon, an emergency HOA meeting was announced. Mandatory attendance for all residents. I went, of course. Everyone did. When we arrived, Craig tried to start the meeting as if everything was normal. But the tension in that room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "First order of business," he said, pretending to keep calm, "is to address the recent media attention regarding our community's display policy." I raised my hand immediately. "You mean the part where you violated federal law?" The room murmured. A few people chuckled quietly. Craig glared at me. "Mr. Dalton, this meeting is not about you personally. It is exactly about me," I said, "and every homeowner here who was told they could not fly the flag. The law says we have the right to display it. You are the one breaking the rules, not us." He stammered for a moment, flipping through his notes. "Well, we were simply trying to maintain neighborhood consistency." "That is not consistency," interrupted Joe from the back. "That is control." The whole room broke into applause. Craig tried to regain order, but it was too late. The board members looked embarrassed. Janet, one of the committee members, leaned over and whispered something to him, but he just shook his head angrily. Finally, one of the residents stood up. "Mrs. Porter, an older woman who had lived here since the neighborhood was built," she said. "My husband served in the Navy for 30 years. You fined me for keeping his flag out front. You should be ashamed." That silence that followed was heavy. Craig looked down at his notes, then at the floor, like a man who had just realized he lost everything. The meeting ended with no resolution. But I knew the story was far from over, because that night, I got another phone call, this time from a national news network. They had seen the local segment and wanted to do a follow-up. I laughed out loud. "Sure," I said. "Come on down. I will even make coffee." By the time they arrived 2 days later, my house looked like a small patriotic festival. Dozens of neighbors had started flying their own flags again. Red, white, and blue, everywhere you looked. Kids were drawing stars on the sidewalk with chalk. Someone even brought cupcakes decorated like little flags. It was amazing. The national news team interviewed several residents, including Joe, Mrs. Porter, and even Janet from the HOA board. Every single person said the same thing, that banning flags was wrong, and it was time for change. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Social media, newspapers, radio talk shows. People across the country were talking about our tiny neighborhood. Freedom was trending, and that was when the HOA finally broke. The board sent out a community-wide email that said, "Effective immediately, residents are permitted to display national, state, and military flags in accordance with federal law." No apology, no admission of guilt, but the message was clear. We had one. That evening, the whole neighborhood gathered on my lawn. Joe brought a small speaker and played patriotic songs. Kids waved sparklers. Mrs. Porter cried and hugged me. We stood there under the sunset, flags waving in the golden light, feeling more united than ever. But the best part, the one that made me grin every time I thought about it, was when the national news anchor closed the segment saying, "The HOA tried to ban the flag, but the people reminded them that some things in America are not up for debate. Freedom always wins." A week after everything settled, the neighborhood looked different. Not just because of the flags, though. There were plenty of those, but because of the feeling in the air. People were smiling again, talking again. You could hear laughter on the sidewalks. It felt alive, like a community again, instead of a controlled housing project. Every porch had some version of a flag. Some were small, some huge. Some people had even added lights to illuminate them at night. It looked beautiful, a sea of red, white, and blue glowing softly in the dark. And for once, the HOA could not say a word. I will never forget the day Craig showed up at my door after it was all over. He looked tired, not angry this time, just tired. He held a folder in his hand and said, "I came to drop this off. The board voted to officially update the HOA bylaws. Flags are now permanently permitted." I nodded slowly. "That is good news." He shifted awkwardly, then said, "Look, I might have gone too far. I was just trying to keep things orderly." "Orderly is fine," I replied. "But when order means people lose their freedom, something is wrong." He sighed. "Yeah, I guess I learned that the hard way." Then, surprisingly, he reached out his hand. I shook it. He walked away quietly, and for the first time, I felt a little sorry for him. Maybe he finally understood that control is not the same as community. Later that evening, I sat on my porch with Joe and Mrs. Porter. The summer air was warm, and the sound of crickets mixed with faint music from a few houses down. Mrs. Porter handed me a slice of pie and said, "You know, you started something here." Joe raised his beer and said, "Yeah, man, you turned this place from silent and scared to proud and loud." We all laughed. Then, as the sun dipped behind the houses, the flags across the street caught the last golden light of the day. They fluttered softly, every one of them shining like a quiet promise. I leaned back in my chair, watching them move with the wind, and I thought about everything that had happened. The notices, the meetings, the cameras, the headlines. All of it started with one simple thing: a flag on a porch. It reminded me that sometimes standing up does not require shouting or fighting. Sometimes it is just refusing to take something down when you know it is right. That night, I wrote a short post online, just to close the story. They tried to ban the flag. The news came. The people stood together. Freedom always wins. It went viral again, not because of me, but because the message was simple and true. The HOA never tried anything like that again. In fact, the next 4th of July, the board helped organize a small block party. Craig even showed up wearing a shirt with the flag printed across it. When our eyes met, he gave a small, awkward wave. I nodded back. That was enough. Now, every time I step out onto my porch and see that flag swaying in the breeze, I feel something bigger than pride. It is peace. The kind that comes when you know you did not let fear win. The kind that comes when a neighborhood finds its voice. And maybe the kind that reminds all of us that no matter how strict the rules get, freedom always finds a way to fly.